You're good to point that out. She's not a journalist. She plays one on TV. She's a Democratic Party hack.
Welcome to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM for Thursday, August 28th. I'm Andrew Walworth, and joining me are Real Clear Politics President and co-founder Tom Bevan and Washington Bureau Chief Carl Cannon. So, guys, we are learning more about the shooter in this tragic attack on the Annunciation Catholic Church yesterday in Minneapolis. He was a male who identified as transgender, and his writings have come to light, which include pictures of gun magazines with slogans written on them, including "Kill Donald Trump," "For the Children," and "6 million were not enough." Tom, we are already in a debate on how to talk about the gender of this killer. What do you make of the national conversation that we're having so far?
Well, we tried to put some of that conversation on Real Clear Politics this morning, but I have to say, I mean, and unfortunately, this is a movie that we've watched a number of times, school shootings over the course of the last, 2 decades, and more recently with a transgender individual as the perpetrator. And getting up and sifting through the coverage this morning as we look to put some of those pieces on Real Clear Politics, I mean, the New York Times, CNN, Time Magazine, I mean, everywhere you looked outside of conservative media, journalists were omitting or eliding over the fact that this person was trans, right? And it was all the typical things. Some didn't even use a pronoun to tell you whether the person was a male, female. It was just about, and they were searching for motives and all this stuff, but very sort of noticeable how the mainstream media would just ignore the fact that this person was trans because it didn't fit the overall narrative. Whenever this happens, by the way, and it's a white nationalist or a right-wing extremist or whatever, they're always identified as exactly that. I mean, these modifiers are always put in there because they're relevant. They add some sort of context and to people's understanding. And what drives me nuts about the media is it's the same thing. They absolutely are trying to keep their readers in the dark about who this perpetrator was, and possibly it may not be the only factor involved, but it is a factor, and it's one that I think readers deserve to know and should know. And the media, it's like anti-journalism. They're doing the opposite of actually informing their readers about the facts of the case, and they're doing it for ideological reasons. And that's just not journalism. It's not what it is. It's not what it should be. And yet here we are.
Well, Mary Ham actually used that phrase. Tom used anti-journalism to describe this. But I read the Washington Post. It's local paper. They talked about trans. They covered this straight. But they had a quote there that was telling. It was from the mayor of Minneapolis, Jacob Frey, who said, "This is about guns. Don't let anybody tell you it's about anything other than guns." So that's the narrative.
And we put Jacob Frey on the front page.
But
today.
But to say that to me, it almost renders you unfit to lead. Guns is one element of this story, but I don't know of the law that Mayor Frey has proposed that would have prevented this killer from owning guns. I mean, I'm not a big defender of the Second Amendment, but that's one factor. But the other factor is the hatred that this shooter had for God, for President Trump, for Jews, apparently, for religious people, for children. This is a seriously deranged person and an evil person. And how this young adolescent went from being, Robert Westman to this monster, Robert Westman, is certainly part of the story, maybe the most compelling part of the story and the most worrisome. It's the second one we've had at a school of a trans person. There's these people in Portland. A huge percent of the arrests of people attacking ICE agents in Portland are transgender people. What's going on in this community? What's going on in the medical world? What are the causes here? Liberals, progressives always say we want to get to the root causes, and I believe that's right. We should. And the root causes of this certainly are not. It doesn't stop with guns.
And the killer himself said in at least part of his manifesto, that he was tired of being trans and that he wished he had never been brainwashed or brainwashed himself into being trans, and that he was keeping his long hair as the last vestige of being trans, and he couldn't chop it off because he couldn't cut his hair because he felt like it would be a defeat, a defeat. And that he would probably cut his hair on the day that he committed this horrible crime. So
these are the facts Tom's talking about. That should be in every news story about this. If you're not putting that in your news story, you're not really covering the story. I agree with that. The most bizarre thing, and maybe it was just a slip up, but there was this ABC News report where this reporter said, and there were names on the gun. President Trump's name is on the gun. It made it sound like the guy was a pro-Trump. The killer was pro-Trump. He was doing it for Trump. And of course, what was on the gun was kill Trump. And that's that. I mean, obviously, that's come out, and that I won't say ABC was deliberately trying to hide that, but that's kind of maybe an inadvertent indication in the mindset of reporters, and we need to get our house in order. That's not professional.
Yeah, I saw on the Real Clear page the excerpt from the interview with Jacob Fry, who was the Minneapolis mayor. It was Jen Psaki who did the interview.
That's right.
And she sort of said the quiet part out loud, because this is where she posed the question to the mayor. She said, "What do you do as a leader of your city to prevent details from being weaponized and using this to blame something other than guns?" I mean, that is a leading question.
Well, remember this, though, Andy. You're good to point that out. She's not a journalist. She plays one on TV. She was a Democratic Party hack. That's what she was. She was a professional politician that they gave a show to, and that's why we should actually have journalists doing these interviews.
It's interesting, though, because in that exchange, he didn't take the bait right there, and he talked about how you shouldn't vilify the trans community, which I have no problem with that message in and of itself. I don't think we should vilify any community. But then later on, he did say that it was all about guns. And to Tom's point, to deny that his name change and this transition is not relevant, it's just to ignore, basic facts that have come out so far and are a significant part of the story about what motivated him.
But this is when we talk about, sorry to interrupt, Andy, but when we talk about, there was this poll that was done not too long ago. I think it was Pew or somebody else talking about how, Americans can't even agree on the facts of events anymore, right? And one of the reasons we can't agree on the facts is because the media isn't always reporting the facts. If you go to conservative media, you see facts. And if you go to some of the liberal media, those facts have been omitted for partisan reasons. I'm sure it works in the other direction as well, but that's part of what contributes to the idea that we have these information bubbles that we can't break out of. Because honestly, if you got up and read the New York Times and that was your only source of news about this shooting, you would have no idea that this person was trans. You would not have seen any of the videos that Carl mentioned. You would not have seen excerpts from the manifesto that talk about some of this stuff. I mean, it's negligent. It's a dereliction of their duty to inform the public, even if that means that, yes, it might be uncomfortable and it might go against, narratives, and it might, certainly some people will try and I don't like the word weaponize in this context, but, for people who have preconceived notions, yes, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't tell anybody about it, that you should just pretend it doesn't exist or didn't happen. That is not what journalism is.
Tom, we had this big shakeup at the CDC. The director, Susan Monarez, was fired after she refused to resign from the post. At least 4 other top officials have resigned as well. She was a Trump appointee who had been in the job for about a month. This seems to be about vaccine policy through her lawyers. She said this. She said she refused, quote, to rubber stamp unscientific, reckless directives and fire dedicated health experts. She chose protecting the public over serving a political agenda. For that, she has been targeted. So, Tom, what's going on at the CDC?
I have no idea. I mean, obviously, a lot of conflict, and those conflicts are bubbling up. And this is one manifestation of that. I mean, you do have RFK Jr., who is skeptical of vaccines, who has made moves. to sort of change the orientation of the government around vaccines and the mandates, and obviously the mRNA vaccines more than anything, and that has come into conflict. You know, Kennedy's supposed to release this big report on vaccines and their possible links to autism, and Susan Menarez at her confirmation hearing just a month ago said she didn't see any links between the two. So that's another conflict that I'm sure is involved in this. So there are multiple conflicts. This is not an insignificant thing when you've got, you know, mass resignations, and reportedly, I guess there might be more on the way. So, I mean, I don't, it's bordering on like a mutiny. Now, some people are happy to think that some of these folks who have been at the CDC who are resigning, it's good riddance to them, and this agency needs to be, I think, sort of refreshed, and some of the people who were involved in some of the COVID stuff need to be out. But it's definitely, these are headlines that reinforce the idea that, you know, there's chaos and turmoil within the administration. That's obviously never a good thing. It's not good for RFK Jr. It's not necessarily good for Trump.
Yeah. So this, you know, Menarez, Carl, is not a holdover from the Biden administration. She's not part of the deep state. She was handpicked by the Trump administration for this very job. And it is kind of shocking. I can't think of a precedent where someone, especially at this level, a month later said, I can't do this anymore. Gets it to the point where they ask her to quit. She refuses to quit. And then they turn around and fire her within 12 hours.
Well, the administration doesn't know where it is on vaccines. During his confirmation hearings, Robert Kennedy Jr. went out of his way to say he was not really opposed to vaccines, that his views had been mischaracterized. He downplayed the autism thing, which is what people who are critical of him use, because this is junk science to link autism to vaccines. There's just no evidence for it, and you know, but he kind of he gives these non-denial denials about it. But just earlier this week, President Trump bragged about Operation Warp Speed. He boasted about it at length, said it was the greatest achievement in the history of the presidency, or some other, you know, he's fond of superlative endings. but but apparently that's not the view of his health secretary. So this idea, you know, that bureaucrats should run the agencies, and that the political people, that shouldn't, that, you know, science, law enforcement shouldn't be politicized. That's not a very sophisticated constitutional view. We have elections, and the bureaucracy, the top levels of the bureaucracy should serve, especially the presidential appointees, should serve at the pleasure of the president, and they should be doing what the administration wants, you know, in theory. But what does this administration want on vaccines? It's quite unclear. They're speaking with two voices. And I think these resignations, I think, as far as I know, they're principled resignations. And to your one other point I'd make, Andy, you pointed out that, you know, the CDC, it used to be one of the most venerated agencies in the federal government. There'd be polls from time to time. I mean, the National Park Service always comes out on top, but it was very highly regarded by the American public. That changed in COVID.
Not anymore.
Well, and that changed in COVID, not because so much about these issues we're talking about, but because the agency, it couldn't even get testing out. It insisted on developing its own test instead of letting the states do it or the labs do it like every other country did. And we were the last industrialized country to even have tests for COVID. And I don't think the agency's ever recovered from that. So probably a cleaning house is a good thing. But these people are resigning. They say they're resigning because they're being asked to do things that they find unethical. And that should worry people.
Yeah, I mean, you know, one point of contention is who gets put on these panels to review things at the CDC, including vaccine policy and stuff like that. That seems to be where, at least where she and Kennedy sort of came into conflict. I will say, I don't know where Jay Bhattacharya is on this. I'd be curious to know if he's got a view on it. He hasn't spoken out on it, but he's a guy that I think a lot of us looked at and said, well, if Jay is going in there, he's a straight shooter. He'll let us know what's really going on. But so far, Tom, I don't think anything from Dr. Bhattacharya on this.
I haven't seen anything, and you're right. I mean, of all the, he was one of the picks that I was, because I've met Dr. Bhattacharya and been at a couple of events where he's spoken, and he's one of the most impressive, sort of thoughtful, circumspect individuals that you would ever possibly meet. And the fact that he, after being ostracized, came back in to run that agency, NIH.
The NIH, National
Yeah, I
Institutes
thought
of Health.
was one of the best moves that Trump made in terms of his second term picks, and so he's a person who's greatly admired and respected, and his viewpoint carries a lot of weight, in my opinion.
Yeah. Carl, in other sort of health news, and it's not completely unrelated, of course, is the FDA came out. They just approved this new COVID-19 boosters. It'll be available this fall, but they did narrow the population who they say should get them. They say the boosters for people over 65 and at-risk patients, but not for everyone. The American Academy of Pediatrics came out. They disagree. They want children to get the vaccine between the ages of 6 months and 23 months. They say should be vaccinated. So again, this vaccine fight, it's very hard if you're a layman to know what the heck is going on here. Who should we believe? If I had a child, in that age group, I'd be wondering what the heck I should be doing.
Well, remember, these are recommendations. If parents can ask for this vaccine, this booster for their children. I'm sort of leaning, like Marty McCary, I lean personally toward not vaccinating children, but my own grandchildren were vaccinated. Their parents made that decision. These are, science is not omniscient, and neither is the American Pediatric Society or the FDA. And I actually think this is a principled difference of opinion. And the idea that parents have to inform themselves to make this decision because you have two, venerated scientific bodies in disagreement, that doesn't seem ideal. But in this day and age, Americans should be able to educate themselves. And I guess the decision is now going to be up to individuals and their physicians.
Well, it also affects how insurance pays for things, because the insurance tends to go by what the FDA says. So you will not be reimbursed, I guess, if you.
Well, I don't know about that. Most of these vaccines turn out to be free. I don't think this doesn't seem to me to be a fight over money. I could be naive about that, but
You're naive about that,
Carl.
Okay. I think it is a fight about what's covered and what's not covered. And quite frankly, I take a little harsher view of the American Pediatric Association. I mean, I think the rush to vaccinate kids all the way up to little babies, 6 months, I think is what they were doing, is insane. Honestly, just crazy. It ignores the science and the data and we knew this early on. We knew that this is a disease. This virus was not life-threatening for kids. And there were just as many instances, that the risks that were posed by giving this vaccine to, younger kids, weren't worth it, given the fact that they weren't in any real jeopardy of losing their lives over this. Obviously, for people 65 and older, yes, of course. I mean, but we knew that within 3 months, maybe even weeks.
Tom, I don't think it's that tidy. I'm sorry. If small children were not dying of COVID, but many of their caretakers were grandmothers, and people who are compromised immune system. I mean, the idea was to knock down the virus. I don't think I really agree with you. I didn't. And the other thing about these viruses that they mutate. The Spanish influenza, or whatever we're calling it these days, the flu of 1918, killed mostly very healthy people in their 20s and 30s, and to this day, no one knows why. So, efforts to suppress a lethal virus with vaccinations, it's something we've been doing in this country for decades, and mostly it's worked.
Well, you're welcome to your own opinion, Carl, even if it is wrong. But, and let's remember, this is
Dr. Bevin says you're wrong, Carl.
Well,
yeah, I noticed that.
These are not traditional vaccines either, Carl. This is the mRNA platform.
The one Trump was boasting about
The
2 days ago.
I get it. Trump wants to take credit for that, and he's thrilled that it
while
got
firing
rushed to market.
people,
But
yeah, in
but
his own
honestly, I think
administration.
the further we get in the rearview mirror, the more we get actual data on this. I think we're going to see this as something that we got wrong, and we didn't do as good of a job as we could have in terms of analyzing this and weighing the risks and possible benefits.
All right. Carl, you want the last word? I'll give you the last
No,
word.
I give it to Tom. Tom summed it up. He did a nice summation of his view, and I reserve the right to dissent.
All right, good. Well, guys, we're going to leave it there. You're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Allworth. I'm here with the two medical experts show, Carl Cannon and Tom Bevan. We'll be back with more right after these words.
Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Tom Bevan, co-founder and president of RCP. Joined now by Mark Penn. He is the co-director of the Harvard CAPS Harris poll and the Stagwell chairman and CEO. Mark, good to have you on the program.
Thank you.
So the latest Harvard CAPS Harris poll is out, and you cover a lot of ground in this poll, Mark, as you do every month. But give me your top takeaways from this month's reading.
Well, look, I think this month, and we've been doing this poll for 7 years, this month I think Trump's ratings stabilized, didn't move up or down, and I think he began to get traction on crime. I think he's now kind of taken his focus from what I would say is immigration first, to then kind of tariffs all over in the middle, to really kind of leading a national crackdown on crime. And I think you're seeing what I would call generally favorable response to it.
Let's talk about crime, because you do go into the Washington, D.C. situation quite a bit. Was there anything in that surprised you? I mean, I know there's been some other data out there suggesting that, look, this is one of those issues that, most Americans do believe crime is a problem in major cities around the country and that it needs to be dealt with. But was there anything from the data that surprised you about what's going on in Washington, D.C.?
Well, look, I think 54% said that they approve of the president's approach relative to using the National Guard in D.C. Look, I think it's interesting right now in general. Anytime I apply the word Trump, it is very hard to get above 50%. If I take his name off the policies, I get 60, 70, 75%, even 80% for, say, locking up criminal people who are here without documentation or here illegally. But when you put his name, the country is so polarized on Trump, and the Democrats will not concede a single inch of anything that the president does, that it's hard for him to get above 50. So when he gets 54% approving, I'm going, wow, that's like, a normal, used to be 65, okay? Because that means I know that there are other people who approve of it, but won't approve of it because we put the name Trump in the questionnaire.
One of the things that there was sort of shockingly bipartisan agreement on, one of the data points in this poll, Mark, was that everyone thinks, Democrats, Republicans, and independents believe that Trump is going to do this somewhere else. This is the Washington, D.C. is only the first, and that this is going to happen in other cities around the country.
Well, look, in fairness to Trump, and kind of, I did an X post on this. When you look at it, we lose about 25,000 people a year to crime, and we lose about 50,000 a year to fentanyl. So that's 75,000 lives every year, right? And forget Gaza, forget Sudan, that's right here in America. And it's really been surprising when you think about it, how these problems have been more or less almost put under the rug. Nobody's talking about the 75,000 dead every year from basically murders and fentanyl. And I think the president is attacking them with a 2x4. And I think ultimately the Democrats can raise all the hootenanny that they want to raise about the methods he's using. But the truth of the matter is they've let the problems fester to getting the unbelievable numbers of dead. I mean, again, we're mourning a church shooting today with 4 dead, okay? Well, there's 4 dead every day in one of our major cities. I mean, it's incredible how much we are not paying attention to the problems. And it is somewhat surprising to me that the Democrats think they can get political advantage by opposing rather than compromising on these issues.
Yeah, and that was another finding is you got to give Trump credit for at least kickstarting the conversation, because what it was like 75% of people, they are aware of what he's doing in Washington, D.C. They're aware of this crackdown on crime. So they have definitely read about it. Whether they agree with him or not, different story. Okay, moving on. It seems like, Mark, that clearly the economy, inflation, still the number one issue on the minds of America. And there Trump is not performing as well. He's lost a little bit of altitude in this first, 6-7 months of his presidency.
Well, I think he's getting his lowest ratings on the economy and inflation at 41%. I think he has a strategy. He believes in that strategy, but in at least the short term here, he is significantly held back by fears about tariffs. Many of them were way overblown, and I think even Fed Chairman Powell finally acknowledged that a tax increase is not inflation, that the central bank can do something about. And in fact, it's a tax that contracts the economy. I think he's counting on, when you look at it, he put in the tax cuts. He's trying to shift basically make it more expensive for you to buy something overseas, comparatively less expensive to produce here. And he needs lower interest rates as part of this equation to get things going. And so he's leaning pretty heavily, whether it will work or not, or whether or not the Fed is just going to get there on their own. I think that's a problem. But when you look at the poll, you would say that his former strong suit, the economy, is now his weak spot. And he's got what I think is about a year. A year from now, people will make their final judgments on how his economic policy is working or not. And it will be the single biggest factor in the midterms. 42% right now see their economic condition is still worsening. Even though that's better than it was before, it's too high a number.
Mark, you also cover foreign policy in this. There was a section on Ukraine and Gaza. And the one thing that jumped out at me is that large majorities of folks thought that he was not going to be able to solve these two conflicts. Obviously, he's had some success in solving some other conflicts, but they look at these conflicts and think that even he might not be able to get these two conflicts resolved.
Well, first of all, it is a public that is razor focused on domestic policy. When I ask people how they're voting, they may be reading a lot of news on foreign policy, but it is down at 2% of the percentage who are seriously voting on it. I think on the Ukraine, the president got in the poll credit for giving it a try, but people basically think that Putin is intransigent, that the meeting was fundamentally unsuccessful because it didn't produce anything concrete, and that he's generally speaking, too lenient on Putin. So again, he's going to see whether he's resolved it. You would say, I would rate that as credit for giving it a try, skepticism that he's going to get there. I think there's a little bit more belief that he might have a chance at resolving what's going on in the Mideast. I think you saw very clearly, about 3/4 support Israel over Hamas. That's a number that's down a couple of points. It was as high as 80%, generally speaking. I think you see concern about people in Gaza, but quite interestingly, because I ask the kind of questions that I used to ask at the White House. So we kind of probe the next level. People think that there are food shortages in Gaza, but they blame Hamas. And 61% blamed Hamas for that, not Israel, because Hamas simply won't give up the hostages, and right now is holding on even though they have lost a war. So I think that you see continued general support for Israel versus Hamas, even though you see a lot of Democratic defections, and you see concern about Gaza, but actually more blame on Hamas. Though significant blame, relative to Israel. I won't say that it's 61-30. There's still a significant proportion blaming Israel, but it's nowhere near a majority. And I think when you look at the polling, it's a kind of a difficult situation because they rate Hamas as the lowest of the low. And yet, the American people, they are conflict avoiders, right? That's why America generally doesn't get involved in foreign policy, doesn't support wars and military action, for particularly long periods of time, historically. But I would say on this, they definitely support the Ukraine, they definitely support Israel. They're on board with Trump trying to end the war. They just don't know how he's going to do it.
Just a couple of minutes left, Mark, and I want to switch back to domestic politics. You mentioned the election. So you had a favorability rating for the parties in here. And I think the GOP was 47 approved, 53 disapproved, so -6. Democrats were 41 approved, 59 disapproved, so -18. And I'm just interested in your take on sort of the Democratic Party brand. We've seen it in a lot of different data, showing it at lows, historic lows in some cases. And yet we saw this special election that took place in Iowa, just the other day, where the Democrat won by pretty easily in a district that Trump carried by double digits just, last November. So what's your take on where the Democrats stand as sort of a national brand, and then how you expect them to maybe perform in the midterms right now if the midterms were held, in the next 10 days?
Well, it'd be a tricky one if the midterms were held in the next 10 days. Look, the Democratic Party is at its lowest ratings. They've come up a bit from their super lows, but generally they used to be close to 50% and they're down at 41. The Republicans are getting higher ratings, but people are still holding on to their partisan suits, right? Even though Democrats are unhappy with the Democratic Party, which some have to be, they're not switching their vote yet. And so the truth is, it's going to take a campaign. That's what campaigns are all about, right? If we held the election today, it would be meaningless, right? And special elections are usually pretty bad bellwethers. I think that if the election was held today and the Republicans got their message out, which in a campaign, which they don't get because the press kind of suppresses most of their message most of the time, I think the Republicans would eke it out if it was held today. But I think it's all going to depend on how people assess the economy a year from now and whether or not Trump can say, look, we're back to the best economy in the world. That's what he's shooting for. He has a set of policies. It's very determined. Is he right? We're going to see. And I think that really is going to be, in this case, the big determinant. I'd say the biggest concern, if I were Republicans, is that you're losing a lot of the Hispanic support that was gained in the election. People underestimate the fact that it was the Hispanic vote, not the white young male vote, that really was the key determinant of the presidential election. And they are very sensitive to how the economy is going because they're working class voters that want to get ahead.
Welcome back to the show. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief, Real Clear Politics, talking now with James Varney, who writes for Real Clear Investigations. But 20 years ago, when I was covering the White House, Jim was a reporter for the New Orleans Times-Picayune. And it's a fine newspaper then. Like all these newspapers, Jim, it's suffered economically and every other way, but it was and you were one of its finest reporters. You one day found yourself as late summer, get the kids back in school, play a little golf, go fishing, but no. Then you find yourself covering one of the worst storms in American history. You got a nice piece, nice retrospective on this. It was 20 years ago, really today, that the storm started to make landfall. I just want you to tell our listeners about it. And before you do, I encourage everybody to read a story. It's riveting. It's very nicely done. And you see what a hell of a reporter Jim was. But Jim, in your own words, what was that like at the outset?
Yeah, well, thanks. It became scary super quickly.
Yeah.
And people in New Orleans really didn't have a history of evacuating prior to that. The first time I even remember the Superdome ever being used as a shelter was in Hurricane George's, which I want to say was like 98 or 99, 98, I think. So a lot of us had stayed and we just figured it would be a bad storm because it didn't look that evil. And then we got up on Saturday morning and I mean, the entire Gulf of Mexico was this clockwise swirl of angry clouds. And it was like, you gotta go. So it happened very suddenly. And then when it hit, it initially looked like it was worse where I am. I'm on the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain, which is about 25 miles north of the city. And the radio was on in New Orleans, and they were talking, and they were saying, yeah, these windows got blown out. And meanwhile, we're underwater. Houses are smashed left and right. It's a pretty heavily wooded county. And it was the following morning that we found out that the levees had broke, and
Right.
you saw what was going on.
Those levees from Lake Pontchartrain into New Orleans. So the water really came from the other side, not from the Mississippi River side.
Well, it came from three places, right?
Okay.
So you had the water coming from Lake Pontchartrain,
Right.
which was already higher because of the storm surge, and you had that storm surge itself. Then you had another break in what they call the Industrial Canal, which is sort of closer to the Mississippi River on the east side of the city. And then there used to be a thing called the Mississippi River Gulf Outlet, which we all called Mr. Go. And it was supposed to be this great business development thing, but no boats ever used it. It was an idea that you would cut, because it's a long trip up the Mississippi from the Northwest Passage to New Orleans. So this was like, oh no, it'll just be a straight shot. You can come in and use the dock, but the railroad's not there. They never used it. Well, this thing acted like a giant syringe that just brought the Gulf of Mexico right into St. Bernard and the Lower Ninth and Eastern New Orleans.
I was covering the White House then, and President Bush, he was actually at a fundraiser in San Diego, Republican fundraiser, late summer when the storm hit. They knew right away that this was serious. Then he went to a VA hospital for an event. Nobody minded that. He flew to Crawford for a day or so. Then he flew to Washington.
Mm-hmm.
And, meanwhile, we're seeing these pictures of 1,000 people dead, 1,400 dead. The Superdome is a hellhole. People stranded for days. People in the White House are saying, we need to get the 101st Airborne there. Well, they were in Iraq. They weren't available. And then Bush comes back to Washington and he says, all presidents sort of fight this instinct. They want to go there and show. People want them to show, but it's tremendous security, and he doesn't want to interfere with the first responders. He finally goes on September 2nd, and there were two images I remember. I want to ask you because you were there. One of them is, Kanye West is out there calling Bush a racist, but this woman, black woman, African American, runs up to Bush and says, "Could you give me a hug?" And he hugs her. And I thought, that's what Americans expect from their leaders. And then the other one, of course, is when he runs into the FEMA director who was over his head.
Michael Brown.
Says, "You're doing a heck of a job, Brownie." And that's what people remember more than the hug.
Right. That I think happened in Mississippi.
Okay.
And I was told later by a magazine writer in the White House crew that, information was very sketchy, right? We didn't have the internet like what we're doing now. There was nothing like that. And all of us in New Orleans that had no power, I wasn't watching any TV. We didn't even publish the newspaper for several days. So you just knew what your little sliver was happening, right? So this guy tells me that Bush is being told, oh, they're doing everything, right? They got all this stuff rolling. And so he gets out of the car thinking everything's great. And he says that to Michael Brown. And everybody on the ground's like, no, it's not like that at all. So he sort of got ill-served, I think, by his people there.
Jim, from a distance now, I say I was covering the White House, but it seemed to me that neither the Bush administration nor the mayor's office, I think Ray Nagin was the mayor at the time.
He was.
Nor Governor Kathleen Blanco. It doesn't seem like any of these people distinguished themselves. Is that too harsh a judgment?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think that's absolutely what happened, right? You had a failure on the local, the state, and the federal level. Now, to some extent, you can say this was unprecedented, right? Nobody had ever dealt with this. And I saw a commenter at Real Clear to my story today saying, I wish you'd gone into a little more about why they didn't do more. And then he does make his own point, which is you couldn't really get to where the dry part of New Orleans was, right? So the federal interstate that comes in on the east and the west, it was flooded either way. So the only way you could get there was by boat or by helicopter or by taking this really roundabout route that David Grunfeld and a photographer and I did, where you come around from the south and the west and then come over the bridge. So just getting relief supplies to New Orleans was a real hassle for at least 2 weeks, probably 3.
It was 3 weeks. You covered this. You had no access to running water, no shower,
Right.
no ice. It's sweltering. It's 100 degrees in the day. I mean, it sounds like you and the photographer and the other reporters there and the first responders that there was a lot of heroism there, just maybe not by our elected officials.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't think what David and I were doing was heroic, right? We were just telling the story, but it was amazing to me how many people did try and come in and help. So they set up this kind of ad hoc command center on the back of the casino, the big land-based casino there. And you would
Yeah.
see people from all over the country. And maybe a week, 8 days after the storm is hit, I'm on a bridge, right, looking over the lower Ninth Ward, which was, of course, completely underwater. And I'm on this bridge and I'm talking to an officer from the Chicago Police Department who's got the black and white checkerboard thing around his hat.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in the water below me is a Zodiac boat from the Los Angeles Swiftwater Rescue Team. I'm like, wow, it's amazing, So, I mean, we were very grateful for that, but it was needed.
Well, I'm going to ask you about two things. We got a couple minutes left. The first is that you use this phrase. In some ways, hurricanes have been on Earth for several millennia, thousands, millions of years, as far as we know. But that this was a man-made disaster, and by that, I had written when I was a younger reporter. I'd gone to New Orleans. And I had written stories about these levees and also about the Army Corps of Engineers. You point cutting paths through the bayou for, and the oil companies being allowed to dredge and could take down trees. Really, the barrier islands that had protected New Orleans historically had sunk, and one of the reasons they had sunk was the environmental degradation of the oil exploration. So, how much of this has sunk in, and people understand that there's environmental consequences to these things that we do.
Well, that point that you're bringing up is one that is involved in a lot of litigation down here now called legacy lawsuits and all. And another factor, I mean, given it's the Army Corps of Engineers that was maintaining the levees, another factor in Louisiana losing all this is we have man-made warped the flow of the Mississippi River to such an extent that all the sediment it used to dump that was putting land back, that doesn't happen anymore. It just all goes out into the Gulf of Mexico. So both of those things are a factor. You've also got more salt water coming in, and that has killed a lot of cypress trees and whatnot. And I don't think that people have focused on that quite as much in Louisiana, because as you just said, in New Orleans, it was a man-made disaster.
Yeah.
In Mississippi, which everybody forgets about, but that place looked like Hiroshima, that was a natural disaster. There was nothing you could do about that.
Jim, we got 30 seconds left. I want to ask you. So you live in New Orleans. A lot of people, Baton Rouge was always the second city in New Orleans. It now has more people than New Orleans. In some ways, it doesn't seem that New Orleans has ever fully recovered from Katrina.
Yeah, I think certainly you're right from a population standpoint. It hasn't. And the East New Orleans that was flooded has never really come back to what it was. But I do think that there has been an influx of a lot of new people. New Orleans kind of had a cachet for a couple of years after Katrina and attracted some people. So I would say, 75, 80% back, but
All
not
right.
100.
Well, that's good because it's one of the loveliest cities in the world. You've been listening to Jim Varney, reporter for Real Clear Investigations. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief for Real Clear Politics, and we'll be back tomorrow at the same time, 3 p.m. in the West, 6 p.m. in the East, where I live, and 5 p.m. in the great city of New Orleans.